Hello and welcome to today's video. We are going to be speaking about abdominal training. This is a topic that is often overlooked, and these muscles are often undertrained at the gym, mostly because of this really poor piece of advice that has permeated the exercise space and is now floating around, unfortunately, that apparently you don't need to train your abdominals directly, and as long as you breathe and brace while performing your compound movements, they're going to be well stimulated. And as long as you're at a low enough body fat percentage, they are going to look good and well defined, which is not true at all. And a lot of us will significantly benefit from directly training our abdominals. You can take a look at me, for example, have a look at this picture from about a year ago, and take a look at this picture just a few months after I started training my abdominals directly. So, even if you are lean enough, and by the way, I was a lot leaner in that first picture, I was at a lower body fat percentage. So, even if you are quite lean already, if there's not much hypertrophy around the abdominal region, it's not going to look as impressive as it could. And besides that, besides just looking good, there are also performance maximizing benefits. So, the abdominals have several functions which we will cover shortly. And training these muscles through their functions and the joints through all their ranges of motion in an appropriate way will help maximize performance and ensure that you're not just looking good but you're performing well. Now, let's begin with some of the muscles that are involved when we speak about the abdominals. Now, usually we only think about the muscles that we can see when we speak about our abs. But there are a lot of other muscles that are deep and not superficial, which means we can't see them, but they play a very important role, and it is crucial that we train them. So let's just understand a little bit about these muscles and what they do. So we can correlate that to the exercises that we perform to stimulate them. Now, let's begin with the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall. So, the muscles on the front. We have the rectus abdominis muscle, which is your six pack muscle. And underneath that, we have the transversus abdominis muscle, which is like a natural weightlifting belt that you have. It runs laterally and it helps, among other things, create a lot of intra abdominal pressure along with the other abdominal muscles, and it provides stability to your lumbar spine. Then we also have the internal and external obliques. So the external obliques are superficial, you can see them from the outside, and they run sort of this way, diagonally downwards, inferiorly. And we have the internal obliques that are deep to the external obliques, so they're underneath, you can't really see them, and they run sort of that way, superiorly, diagonally, and upwards. And there's also this tiny little muscle called the pyramidalis, which is somewhere down here, below your rectus abdominis muscle. So it's inferior to the rectus abdominis muscle. But fun fact, not a lot of people have that muscle. So about 20% of the human population just doesn't have that muscle. And that's all right, because the contribution of the pyramidalis in the function of your abdominals isn't very great. And the other muscles contribute more significantly. Now, that covers the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall. We also have muscles on the back, and you must be thinking, wait, isn't that like my lower back? And how's that my abs? Well, they are still muscles that make up your abdominal wall, which is all of these muscles around this region between your rib cage and your pelvis. So, these muscles form a wall, literally a wall that holds your organs inside. So we have our intestines, your gallbladder, part of your kidneys, and these organs need protection, and unlike the thoracic region, which has this bony structure like our rib cage that protects our heart and lungs, over here there's just an empty space. If you've noticed, I'll put up an image of a skeleton for you. So there's just empty space over there, and the organs need to be protected, and that's what the abdominals do. That is one of their functions, and they are a group of muscles that basically wrap around and allow us to move about in a bunch of different directions. So it is important that we train all of them. And yes, this includes the muscles on the posterior abdominal wall as well. And you may be wondering, what are those muscles? Well, we also refer to them as our hip flexors, because that is also one of the functions that they perform. Along with flexing our trunk forwards, they also create flexion of the femur at the hip joint. So they allow us to bring our legs up like that, basically. And what are these muscles? Well, we have the psoas major, the psoas minor, which again isn't present in about half of the human population, but that's fine. The psoas major is the major or the most powerful, one of the most powerful hip flexors. And we also have the iliacus muscle, and there is a muscle called the quadratus lumborum, which is located sort of laterally. And we also have the inferior part of the diaphragm muscle that assists in breathing. So that is also a part of the posterior abdominal wall. So that covers the muscles of the abdominal wall. Now, let's speak about some of their functions. So what do these muscles help us do? Well, from an exercise perspective, they help us, well, number one, flex our spine. So spinal flexion, concentric spinal flexion, or bending your trunk this way forwards. And they also help us perform lateral flexion of the spine, which is this way, bending sidewards. And they also help us rotate our spine like that. And besides this, of course, like I mentioned, one of their primary functions, although this is not related to exercise and it's not really relevant in this context, they do protect the organs of the viscera, and they also assist in breathing, and they also help us do things like coughing and vomiting and urination and defecation as well, by virtue of creating that intra-abdominal pressure. And that is also another function of these muscles. By contracting, they increase the pressure within the abdominal cavity, and they create this rigid, stable, airtight cylinder. You can think of it like a pressurized cylinder. And the utility of that is it helps take some stress off of the lumbar spine and keep it in that nice, neutral, safe position. And that is very important. Stability and that rigidity is necessary when we perform various tasks. So that covers the functions of the abdominal muscles. Now, let's speak about some of the exercises that we can use to train these muscles through all of their functions. And another function that I forgot to mention is, of course, stability, and that comes along with creating all that intra-abdominal pressure. So these muscles are also responsible for stabilizing the torso. So they are capable of performing all of those movements, so flexion, lateral flexion, and rotation, but they also help us prevent those movements when they are not desirable by keeping us firm and rigid. Now, let's come to the exercises that we can use to thoroughly stimulate these muscles. So let's begin with the spinal flexion type of movements. My personal recommendations would be a decline sit-up and a hanging leg raise, or any variation of a leg raise. You can, if you can't hang from a bar, you can use a sling where you have your upper arm supported, and you can also perform it on a captain's chair. where you have some support. And the reason why I prefer these movements over just a pure spinal flexion, because there is some hip flexion involved in these movements as well, is that because of that hip flexion component, we are also getting a good stimulus for the muscles on our posterior abdominal wall, the hip flexor muscles that I spoke about. And we don't really train those muscles in isolation in the gym. So, this will give us an opportunity to stimulate those muscles and really comprehensively train our abdominals. Now, coming to the lateral flexion. Well, this can be trained by performing a simple lateral flexion by holding a dumbbell on one side at a time. And you can also perform lateral flexions with a 45-degree bench that is used for the hip extensions. So the hip extension machine, the 45-degree hip extension, you can lie on it sideways and perform your lateral flexions. And that is a great exercise as well. Now, coming to the rotations. Spinal rotation, you can use something like a seated Russian twist, and that would be my recommendation. You can also perform exercises like wood choppers on the cable station, and you can vary the heights of the pulleys and make sure that you're getting a thorough, comprehensive stimulus by aligning it with all the different muscle fibers of primarily your obliques. That is what you will be training with these spinal rotation type of movements. So that covers all the movements that we can include, or rather the dynamic exercises that we can include to train our abdominals. Now, one very important consideration that we need to keep in mind when we perform these dynamic exercises for the abdominal muscles is to take our approach with progressive overload very, very cautiously. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to load these movements over time and build our strength, but we need to be very careful while doing so because of the joints that are involved. And those joints are the joints of the lumbar spine, the vertebrae of the lumbar spine. And due to the way the spine is built, essentially, and also due to our lifestyles in today's day and age, our spines have grown to not tolerate these movements under load very well. So we need to give them some time to adapt. And the lumbar spine in particular has a natural inward curve. So it's called a lordotic curvature, and that is natural and healthy because in that position all the vertebrae of the lumbar spine stack up neatly one on top of the other, and any force is dissipated evenly, it's distributed evenly through all the segments of the lumbar spine. But when there is flexion that's happening, and then there is also load on top of that, then there is a disproportionate amount of force that is borne by one particular segment of the lumbar spine, and that force is not being distributed evenly, and that can cause a lot of problems. And it doesn't have to be a large amount of force applied for a short period of time. For example, when people lift something really heavy with their backs instead of their knees and they end up popping their backs, or while deadlifting with improper technique. So there's a little bit of lumbar flexion that happens, and that usually leads to a disc herniation or a disc bulge. That is one mechanism via which injuries occur. But even low doses of force applied over extended periods of time can cause injuries. They can cause disc herniations and disc bulges. And I'm talking about sitting down. You can think of that because we spend a lot of our time sitting down in today's day and age, where the lumbar spine again is in that slightly flexed position for extended periods of time, which is also why our spines are not as resilient in today's day and age. So keeping these factors in mind, We need to be very cautious with our approach when we train and when we perform these dynamic exercises. So, spinal flexion, lateral flexion, and spinal rotations. And we have to take our approach very slowly towards progressive overload. Now, with that being said, we can also train our abdominal muscles using static exercises. And these you can load quite a bit. So, like I mentioned, our abdominals are also responsible for stabilizing our trunk. And we can create a stability challenge to train these functions. So, think about exercises like farmer's carries, and you can even perform isoangular movements like planks, for example. But those tend to become very easy after a while, and loading them becomes a bit of a challenge. So, you can perform heavy carries like farmer's carries and farmer's walks, and you can also perform suitcase carries. So, just holding one heavy kettlebell or heavy dumbbell uh, in one side and then performing a walk. And that is going to challenge your stability because it's trying to pull you down laterally this way. So, those are also some options that you can consider, and those are great ways of training all the muscles in your abdominal wall safely. Now, that covers pretty much everything that I had to share with you with regards to abdominal training. Start applying this to your training regimen right away. Start training your abs directly and build yourself a nice, strong set of abdominals. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.